First of all, let me thank you, Barbara and Dario, for inviting me to give this lecture, which triggers, memories, some good, some otherwise interesting. And as Dario was mentioning, 20 years ago we had a fire, but I was also the first computer science student at Collegio Superiore at the time, which was in Dario's first year as director. And at the time, we used to attend actually quite often all the brilliant lectures that the Institute of Advanced Studies was also already offering at the time. And I think it was in probably November 2001, when there was this incredible lecture by Professor Douglas Hofstadter, who's been a widely revered authority among computer scientists. And the lecture was eye-opening for many of us. It introduced the word serendipity in many of my friends' vocabulary. It taught students about computational concepts like recursion, context-free grammars, incompleteness theorems, and Professor Hofstadter even taught some people how to draw ambigrams, which are one of his signature puns. Now, it was an amazing lecture, which I did not attend because at the time I was so obsessed with the college requirements that I was struggling with the calculus course. And I felt I had better stay in and study. And I remember this flow of enthusiastic students coming back into the Hall of Residence, with their eyes wide open. And I spent the next 20 years regretting to have missed that lecture and not meeting Douglas Hofstadter. So being invited to speak tonight by the Institute is a bit of a contrapasso punishment for me. Yeah, that was a long time ago. As Barbara said, I'm now a public servant in the UK. I've had a slightly unconventional career. I graduated in computer science. I then worked for a couple of years in clinical data services in the Italian public healthcare sector. I then had a very brief stint as a PhD student at Imperial College London. I swiftly escaped after 6 months. And then I spent the next decade leading computational research systems in a medical school. And while doing that, I became somehow acquainted with the concept of open data advocacy, developing an interest in policy, and ended up advising the UK government at the height of its interest in open data. And that story ends with me joining the machinery of government. So between 2018 and 2 weeks ago, I was the head of data at the Department for Transport, where I led the setting up, let's say, of data capability, both from a analytical perspective and also policy making. And my work at the DFT, lived through a number of interesting crises, number of Brexit deadlines, the collapse of airlines, the pandemic. All of this, was hard but very interesting in terms of data. And as of last week, I'm in a new job. I joined the National Health Service in a new organization called NHSX, and I head the Artificial Intelligence Campworks team. So, setting up basically experimental use of AI in the healthcare system. Now, the nature of my background, together with my experience in public sector, has fundamentally two consequences. First, that I interpret the concept of data in the broadest sense possible. So data to me is everything that can be stored in a digital form, that it can be processed on the computer. So text is data, images are data, sound is data, maps are data. Secondly, the word, when I speak of public communications, I'm also looking at it in the most inclusive way. So the word public in this lecture refers to the fact that the intended recipient of the communication is as broad as possible. The producer of the communication is someone working with the public. And we'll see examples in this lecture that involve both public authorities and the media. So the aim of this lecture is to show you the concerns and opportunities that using data offers to someone working in the public sphere. So first I'll discuss some of the milestones in the long march of data into public consciousness. Secondly, I will give you a few snapshots of the uses of data in public communications, including the advent of official statistics. Third, we'll see a few issues connected to the pervasive use of data during the recent pandemic. And fourth, I'll try and highlight a few common problems for reflection, possibly some rethinking of the way we use data in the world of policymaking and the media. And I'll just remind you, I'll circulate a list of references, full bibliography at the end of the lecture. So if you're curious, everything will be shared at the end. So we are in the age of data, and we've been for some time. These two charts are a bit gimmicky, but they show the frequency of the occurrence of data in different corpus of text. So on the left, we have Google Books Archive, so literature, and on the right, we have debates at the House of Commons in the UK Parliament. So we can see a definite upwards trend of mentions of the word data all over the 20th century. Politicians in the UK are increasingly referring to data. Politics seem to be picking up things with a 10-year delay, but that's probably a point for a different lecture. But then this is just a snapshot, but it gives you an idea of how the growth of data has experienced in the past few years. Now, while I was researching some of the main concepts of using data in public communications, I came across the writings of this guy, Cesare Battistini. Those of you who are Italian probably know Battistini as a nationalist and was involved in the annexation of Trentino. Countless roads, squares are named after Battistini. But he was also a geographer. In this graduation thesis in 1898, researched the geography and anthropology of the Trentino region. And a few of the elements of that thesis are of interest to us. Because first, the fact that Battistini is researching data and national statistics for his work, national statistics being at the time those of the Austrian Empire. And Battistini has a few complaints about the difficulty of finding data for his thesis. He writes in the preface, I could have done more, especially in the statistical field, if there was not in our country such a reluctance to confide in the public domain data, facts, and news. Now, this is quite an interesting phrase because it captures a few issues that we'll touch upon tonight. So the emergence of national statistics, the idea of government transparency, and of course, the politics of data collection and use. Second, we are interested in the political nature of this thesis, right? But this uses data and statistics, but these are not used in a neutral way. So for example, chapter 1 opens with these words: only part of the region within the geographic borders of Italy coincides with the borders of linguistic Italy. So as you can see, Battistini's thesis will be fundamentally an argument for the annexation of Trentino. And data is being used here to make this political argument. Now, third, the work of Battistini is full of maps, and maps are intimately related to some of the technical aspects of data. So maps are, alongside charts, the first way that many people come into contact with data. And you might be used to thinking of maps as something entirely graphical, sometimes beautiful art pieces. But maps are fundamentally representations of data. And as such, they are a good starter to explore data concepts. So what are these concepts? So first of all, there is a question about what we're trying to represent, so the entities. On the map, we have buildings, streets, points of interest, lakes, rivers, seas. Some of these entities will change over the course of time. So for example, rivers can become deviated with dumps. Now, if you look at the map of the city of Trento here, before the annexation and after the annexation, you will see that some of the streets of 1800s Trento are still in the same place, but they've changed their name. So the first question you might ask yourselves is, if we wanted to make a comparison, how do we keep track of changing names, of changing boundaries, of changing paths? And so how do we link in data to entities that we know are related in real life? And these concepts of entities, shapes, and boundaries are important whenever we want to count things over time. For example, we might want to know how the GDP of each province in our country evolved historically. This means that we need to keep track of the changing boundaries of the provinces and to decide how to deal with provinces that were created, merged, sometimes they ceased to exist. And there is a researcher at the Bruno Kessler Foundation called Maurizio Napolitano. He's an incredible guy who knows a lot about the technicality of these issues. And that reminds me that entities are not always attributed to their natural owner. So there are towns currently in the Italian region of Veneto whose cadastral land register is run by the province of Trento for historical reasons. And this brings up a question of ownership. Who owns the definition of such entities? And that's a problematic question if you start thinking, for example, about border disputes. So don't look too far. The Mont Blanc summit has been disputed between France and Italy for a long time. There's a three-way dispute ongoing over the border that falls in Lake Constance between Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And there is even a regional dispute in Italy over the Marmolada mountain between the Italian regions of Trentino and Veneto. And the issue of border definition is more pervasive than one might think. Maps are often drawn by the state to reify its claims. In that respect, maps and data are pretty much tools of governance that do not necessarily reflect the reality of the space they represent. And it's not just states. If you've heard about OpenStreetMap, it's a Wikipedia for maps, a community-led website that allows people to create collaboratively a map of the world. Well, clearly, whenever there's a community, there's a conflict, and there's been conflict in this community about borders and names. The most famous of these being the one about the official naming of Jerusalem. So OpenStreetMap allows multiple names in multiple languages to coexist. However, there is also one overall master name. And in Jerusalem's case, two competing groups fought over the right to assign that master name. The community took somehow a Solomonic approach, opted for not assigning this name at all until this group could reach an agreement. So good luck with that. It's quite unlikely they will. But as you can expect, this issue hasn't had a resolution, and it shed some light on the concept of ownership of definition. Now, Jerusalem clearly is an edge case to almost everything, but we'll see that agreed definitions, their authoritative ownership, the process of collecting data, so in 2 words, data standards, these are very important elements in the discussion around the use of data in public communications and their credibility. So historically, we have some great examples of data and data visualization used for political and social purposes. One I'd like to mention is William Dubois, who was an American professor of sociology. He was a black man, born only after a few years after the abolition of slavery. And he was the organizer of a display for the 1900 World's Fair called the Exhibit of American Negroes. And the exhibit was a varied collection, which is today remembered mostly for its inclusion of what we could call infographics. And once again, the infographics had an agenda. In this case, the agenda was to demonstrate the progress that had been made socially and economically by African Americans. Now, an interesting point to make here is that the US had in fact been running a national census every 10 years since 1790. But there wasn't much data available about African Americans. Now, the undercounting of African Americans is sadly still a problem today. So that project at the time employed clerks, students, basically, let's say free labor to assemble and run the great machinery of a census. And this is another interesting angle of inquiry. So the existence or the lack of existence of data collection can be itself a political action. And in this case, a potential act of discrimination against a group. And on the other hand, this is also an example of data used politically against discrimination. Now, the most famous historical example of the use of data is probably John Snow's map of cholera. So the map of cholera-related deaths. This is often hailed as the founding event in the history of epidemiology. So the story here is halfway through the 1800s, there was a deadly outbreak of cholera in central London, and John Snow, who was a physician researching the disease, took this data-driven approach. He interviewed local residents about the deaths in the area. He analyzed the patterns of those deaths, and he produced this now famous map that suggests a very localized problem. The problem was a dirty water pump. So the local council was persuaded to disable that water pump, and this massively reduced the numbers of deaths. Now, there's a lot of myth around the story, but the map became pretty much a staple for every public health specialist because it just captures how good data and good data visualization can be actioned. Snow is remembered for other scientific contributions. For example, he asserted the germ theory, but the actionability of data analysis and visualization is also one of his strong legacies. Now, I could make here a little digression about the pandemic. I'll reserve it for later. Let me just note that compared to COVID-19, let's say cholera is somehow easier to diagnose, but also similar to COVID-19, in John Snow's time, there wasn't any readily available data source. So John Snow had to create his own data source at the time of emergency from an unreliable source of data. So keep these themes in mind because we'll see they will be recurrent. Now, the age of official statistics starts in the 20th century, although we know censuses being run for thousands of years. I mean, those of us who were brought up in the Western world certainly familiar with the events told by the Gospel of Luke The Holy Family was traveling from Galilee to Judea in order to respond to the census run by the Romans, the rulers of that region. I mean, this is probably an inaccurate account. The Romans, however, did run censuses for real. The ancient Babylonians and Egyptians did 2,000 of years before the Romans. The Han Dynasty in China recorded data about over 57 million people living in 12 million households just at the same time with the Romans. So the census in the ancient era was often a way simply to determine how many taxes a citizen had to pay. In modern times, the US had been running the census every 10 years since 1790, similarly the UK since 1801. But censuses were often a prelude to the establishment of official national statistics, which are a characteristic of the 20th century. How the Italianistat was set up in 1926, the British Central Statistics Office, precursor of today's Office for National Statistics, in 1941. So why were these institutions created? Well, they responded to a need of answering questions with numbers and figures. And this need was itself a consequence of social transformations, the expansion of the electoral franchise, the birth of new economic activities. The policymaking started to have a thirst of evaluation, which could only be answered by data and statistics. So the birth of official statistics puts data firmly in the public communication arena. And with this, we start to see the first issues in the way data is incorrectly communicated, or how difficult it is to communicate. Let's see, for example, employment statistics. Employment statistics were among the first ever collected, and they are probably very politically sensitive. And employment statistics are connected to two of the major points I'd like to make tonight. Process and definition. So by process, I mean the way the data is collected, and by definition, I mean how a common sense concept, in this case, unemployment or employment, is translated into data. Now, in most countries, official employment statistics are an estimate. They don't come from a magic box that records every employed or unemployed person. They come from surveys. There is a panel that is repeatedly interviewed about their employment status. And surveys are based on samples. Therefore, they are the characteristic of representing a larger population with a certain degree of accuracy. And communicating properly the concept of how a survey works is vitally important. There's a fantastic book by David Spiegelhalter called The Art of Statistics, which is a mine of examples of bad communication of statistics. I strongly recommend if you want to explore these issues. One of the examples puts the BBC in the spotlight. So in 2018, the BBC reported the fall of UK unemployment by 3,000 people in the previous trimester. Except the official figures come from a survey, and that survey had a reported margin of error of 77,000, which means that in reality, there was a range of potential values that included both increases and falls. The BBC journalists interpreted this survey as a real figure rather than as an estimate, and this produced a potentially misleading headline. Secondly, the issue of definitions. If you take a random person and ask them if they work, they will have an answer. They will know if they work or not, whether their work is full-time, part-time, casual, if they're retired, or anything in that spectrum. But when we're looking at employment statistics, we are seeing data about a specific definition of employment. And this definition might be incredibly technical, to the point of being, let's say, hard to relate to for people who are not statistically trained. And what's more, that definition can be different in different countries or even within the same country over time. So in the UK, let's have a look at the definition. This comes from the Labour Force Survey, and this defines an employed person as anyone aged 16 or over who has completed at least 1 hour of work per week. And this is a very technical definition, which might not relate to, to your experience or my experience, what meaningful employment looks like. And this definition is not even set in stone. So for example, here we see in December 2019, the ONS and the House of Commons made a little change to the way they report the unemployment rate. So this rate is usually calculated as the number of people who are unemployed divided by the total population. That total population is a definition, and that changed from the economically active population aged 16 to 64 to the total population aged 16 to 64. This change is probably subtle. Probably you missed it unless you've written it down, but it shows how confusing definitions can be for those who are not trained in statistics and economics. Now, to give you an additional angle on this, these are the questions that the US Bureau of Labor Statistics asked its employment panel to determine whether someone is employed. It's a complex set of 11 questions that get combined into an unemployment rate. In fact, it's not one unemployment rate. This produces 6 alternative unemployment rates, which are used for different purposes. Germany famously used to exclude anyone aged 58 or over from the count on the grounds that they were too close to retirement to be significant. Now, these differences don't make comparison between countries impossible, but it becomes really important to be aware of a growing number of caveats in order to make a honest and accurate comparison. Now, there is a lot of nuance in communicating insight, and this obviously conflicts with the urge to make it actionable. And the more general point here is that the simplification of real life into data points is troubling. Most categorizations, elide useful details, and policymaking and communication based purely on endpoint statistics is problematic. Another interesting example are averages. As you know, the term average in mathematics is not a single concept. In primary school, we learn that there are 3 averages: the mean, the median, and the mode. Pythagoras defined 3 ways of calculating the mean, so the arithmetic mean, the geometric, and the harmonic means, and there are many more. Now, when people think about an average, they tend to refer commonly to the arithmetic mean, and that's how they interpret the word average whenever they hear it in the media, except it's not always what it means. For example, the Office for National Statistics uses the geometric mean for its average house prices, and it uses both the arithmetic mean and the median for the average household income. Rarely, if ever, these concepts are fully explained by the media reporting the values. This is particularly hard to address. It makes it difficult for the average listener to discern whether we're talking about an average income, which is a mean, as opposed to the income of the average person, which is a median. Or if we're talking about the price of the average house, a median, or the average price of a house, which is a mean, but not the arithmetic mean. Now, speaking more broadly and more easily, it can be easy to misunderstand or misuse mathematical concepts, especially as the media and politicians themselves sometimes struggle to understand them or use them properly. A famous case here in the UK involved Michael Gove, who was the Secretary of State for Education, speaking about the rating of schools. He said that all schools should be rated good. Broadly speaking, a school is rated good if it is above the national average. And you see the problem coming. Taken mathematically, these 2 statements are incompatible. Now, Gove appeared before a parliamentary select committee where he was pretty much ridiculed by the chair of the committee for this statement. And this conversation happened. The chair questioned Michael Gove, if good requires pupils to exceed the national average, and if all schools must be good, how is this mathematically possible? And Gove retorted, well, by being better all the time. And the chair went like, is it possible, is it? Michael Gove said, is it possible to better all the time? And then the final drive from the chair was, were you better at literacy than numeracy, Secretary of State? Now, of course, Michael Gove was not referring to a mathematical definition of average. He was thinking of a quality threshold set at one point in time and challenging schools to go beyond it over time. But by using a term with a mathematical connotation, he exposed himself to criticism. It is remarkable to me, in fact, that no one asked him to actually clarify what the definition of average was in this case. On the opposite side of the UK political spectrum, Diane Abbott was famously criticized when she gave a set of incoherent statistics about police funding, showing a failure, let's say, to grasp basic multiplications and division. So episodes like this have actually encouraged 2 equally damaging behaviors. So the media, in this context of rapid news churning created by social media mostly, have increasingly started to chase politicians' mathematical numbers more for their comedic values, to make fun of them, than to focus on rational, pondered, or slower fact-checking. And the other damaging behavior has been the introduction, let's say, of evasive maneuvers by politicians in order to escape such questions entirely. And the more we look at this subject, the more interesting it gets for those of us working with data and public communication. In 2012, the Royal Statistical Society ran a survey among members of parliament. 97 MPs out of 650 were asked, if you spin a coin twice, what is the probability of getting 2 heads? And now only 40% of MPs gave the right answer. The survey also asked if they generally felt confident when dealing with numbers, and over 70% expressed confidence. Now, probability might not be the easiest topic for the untrained, but this is a basic probability problem. So how can we expect the world of politics and media to report and use figures accurately if such a simple question has such a poor ratio of correct answers? And one element of reflection about this use and misuse of statistics and other mathematical concepts is a piece of research run by the National Center for Social Research. They surveyed the general public on their perceptions and attitudes toward national statistics. And it's remarkable that the public has strong confidence in national statistics. You see the figure close to 90%, but only a minority, 45%, thinks that the government presents official figures honestly, and 17% thinks that newspapers present official figures honestly. And the attitude of politics and media towards the use of numbers in the political debate is not helpful, because now there is this expectation that leaders should always give yes, no answer, and they are expected to quote from memory data to back those binary answers. And there are two issues with this. The first is what I would call data washing, which means increasingly use data in a pseudoscientific way to back claims that cannot really be backed by data. And the second is that often there is much uncertainty to be conveyed, and the political discourse hasn't yet learned to cope with uncertainty in our reality, which is complex. And the driving media for a clear answer from politicians is a reaction to years in which evasive answers were the norm, but as all reaction, it has produced this generation that doesn't cope well with doubt. And politicians are now convinced that answering "I don't know" is a bad thing. And this problem, of course, goes beyond data. Journalists love to ask difficult questions about complex problems, expecting yes, no answers. The problem with difficult questions and complex problems is that they need equally complex answers. And the introduction of data in the public sphere has made this problem worse, because there is now a way to get out of this difficult question by misquoting data no one will realize, or even to say, the data shows, the data says, except data is often not a crystal ball and should not be used that way. Now, I could spend hours giving you dozens of examples that include, correlation used as causation, reverse causation, which our tabloid press loves, the confusion between absolute risk and relative risk, another favorite of the press in this country. There is the Simpson paradox, which is one of the most difficult problems to grasp whenever reporting about groups. But for time's sake, I'll stop here and move on to the next chapter, which is about data journalism, an important development in recent years, which is basically the use of data to tell journalistic stories, sometimes through the adoption of interactive applications. Data journalism has brought data into the mainstream. We have even broadsheet newspapers presenting data-driven stories on their front pages. The problem here is that data journalistic stories usually need an angle. And remember what I said at the beginning, data is rarely used in a neutral way. Silly example here, in 2018, the Financial Times represented the results of the Italian elections by making this map that shows the party or coalition that got the most votes in each constituency. So interpreting, let's say, the Italian electoral system as a first past the post. Now, the result of this, and that's what the story said, is a country divided in three. And this is a captivating story. It does somehow reflect on other cultural, social, and economic aspects of Italy. But let's not forget, telling this story is a choice. Now, I produced a couple of very ugly dot maps to make a counter-argument to this story. Now, dot maps don't show the winner in a region. They simply show a dot for every, let's say, 10,000 votes each party gets. These are obviously ugly, and I blame entirely my lack of aesthetic taste for this. But what I'd like you to see is that I'm choosing to tell a different story. The story I'm choosing to tell here is that Italy wasn't as divided as it was confused. So neither of these two stories is the truth. Maps don't lie, maps tell a story. The way we choose to represent data is an editorial choice. And I'm not criticizing data journalists for that. Actually, making editorial choices is their job. But what we need to remember is this phenomenon. The map is not the territory, as the saying goes. On a positive note, many in data journalism have taken up the idea of replicable journalism, which comes from academic research. There are now some great examples of it. Recently, this was from the Washington Post. They create a narrative based on data models, and they release the source code. They offer the technical write-up with citation credits and release notes, exactly as if this was an academic paper. Now, this degree of honesty and transparency can help build trust in the assumption that the reader base is educated to a level that enables them to understand. And I think we are at the crossroads, how we can balance the need for transparency and honesty with the need to be accessible to a public who's yet to appreciate very difficult concept that sometimes cannot be simplified. The other big shift in journalism has been the increase in what we could call predictive journalism. I'm sorry about the joke I have on this slide, but we've seen this in many shapes, ranging from sports to electoral predictions, very hot topic with the recent US election. We've seen models about hospital beds being used during the pandemic. Predictions are always dangerous because, of course, they can be wrong. It's in their nature. And as a data geek myself, I find this move towards predictive data journalism intriguing and exciting. Although it brings with it a philosophical question about the use of data in journalism. Is the job of journalism to tell stories that describe the world, or is it to use data to tell what the future holds? In fact, it can be a bit of both, and the balance is both a philosophical quest as much as it is a market-driven choice. Mona Chalabi, who's the data editor for the US edition of The Guardian, has written and spoken extensively on this topic. And in a recent interview, in which she spoke about the allegedly wrong prediction for the past US election 2016, she asked this question: since when is it our job to predict? And that's a very good question. However, the boundaries between data-driven storytelling and data-driven prediction are full of gray areas. So all things considered, I believe that data journalism has been broadly positive in addressing one of the other problems that we see in data communication, so how to convey the concept of uncertainty. And for example, The Guardian here did this for the US presidential election, allowing readers to play with the different routes that a victory could look like for Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Similarly, the Financial Times, and in the New Statesman, allowed reader to rerun the model. In the same did 538, the blog of statistician Nate Silver, which offered a way to see the prediction being recalculated in real time by choosing to assign states to either Biden or Trump. Another clever way to use uncertainty in data-driven journalism is to encourage the reader to reflect on his or her own lack of knowledge. And the German newspaper Berliner Morgenpost has repeatedly taken this approach to invite the readers to reflect on the consequences of the unification of the two German states 30 years ago. In one example, they invited readers to draw the path of the Berlin Wall on a map and then reveal what other readers thought together with the real path. And in another occasion, they allowed the reader to cut through Germany in two, revealing how the two sides compared by using official statistics. And I think these are all powerful examples because they allow the reader to appreciate the uncertainty, to understand the lack of knowledge about the topic, learn something from it. And this is all by using data-driven interactive visualization. Let's not forget, however, that visualization is not always the most appropriate tool for this. And there is something, sometimes a degree of uncertainty that will be impossible to properly capture in a graphic. So making the public appreciate that data can carry uncertainty, and the data can trigger questions rather than give certain answers, is ultimately a necessity for public data communicators. Now, some of these themes have become evident or even amplified during the COVID-19 pandemic, with the emergence of data as a daily matter of discussion, with interesting reflections about the usefulness of data. So the most important question in the pandemic is what data is most useful to monitor and manage it. So we've seen a ceaseless series of arguments as to what data was the most useful in understanding dealing with pandemic. And the number of positive patients depends strongly on the number of tests being administered, of course. The number of hospital admissions carries a lot of uncertainty because patients might be admitted with a variety of other conditions. The ratio of available beds is an uncertain variable because under pressure it is common to squeeze in a few more beds. For example, in Italy, we see this, and there is a habit of having a set of so-called sub-intensive therapy beds that can be transitioned into full intensive therapy beds upon need. Think about the controversy in Italy that happened around counting beds in Calabria, where the local authority decided to exclude assisted ventilation patients from the total count, allegedly as a way to be classified as a lower risk area. And none of this data is, of course, readily available in any easy to consume format. Finally, reporting death figures is somehow useful to understand how serious the pandemic is, especially in comparison with longer term death rates. And in all these different data sets or data processes can be helpful. The question being, what do they actually mean, how accurate they are, and how they can be actioned. But death especially offers us another dig into the problem of definitions, because as you can probably see this now, how we define death has an impact on how we account for it. So let me start with the local example in the UK. Public Health England, the authority for this sort of things, changed its definition of a COVID-19 related death in August by including deaths that happened, let's say, a bit later on compared to the previous definition. Now, this matters because, of course, there might not be a way to clearly attribute a death to COVID. So this expanded definition might capture more COVID-related deaths, but it might also capture deaths of patients diagnosed with COVID whose death was not, let's say, a direct consequence or a unique consequence of COVID. And this is not wrong or right. It is a matter of understanding and communicating well the definitions. Now, it is good, for example, the press started to use the phrase dying with COVID as opposed to dying from COVID, which also triggered all sorts of jokes and memes on the internet. But other problems might be impacting death counts. And it is known, for example, that at the beginning of the pandemic, the counts missed a lot of deaths happening at home or in care homes. And this is very serious because let's say, the concept then needs to be communicated clearly, and sometimes people relate to that in a way that doesn't really play well with the idea that you could define what a death is. This problem, of course, is to me particularly intriguing, and sorry if this sounds morbid or philosophical. And as you can imagine, it's not limited to COVID-19. Another book I recommend is called How to Make the World Add Up by the Financial Times economist in Harvard, which mentions a rather sobering, I would say, example from a few years ago. In the UK, there was a case where mortality rates for newborn babies varied massively between different parts of the country, and further research showed the same difference between different countries of Europe. And this, of course, would be a cause of massive concern. But it turns out that there was a major difference in the way where definitions of births and deaths worked. So normally, when a pregnancy ends early, let's say long before the 23rd week, the event is recorded as a miscarriage. And concurrently, another rule says if a baby is born prematurely at the 24th week, then doctors must record this event as a live birth. Now, it turns out that when pregnancies ended early, at around the 23rd, 24th week mark, the fuzziness of the situation caused data recording to be largely discretionary. So some doctors would record this event as a live birth with a subsequent death, while others would put it down as a single event, as a miscarriage. And this was caused, of course, by a largely cultural set of considerations. Now, what matters to us is that in an event that could sound as clear to us as a death or as a miscarriage, it's not as clear when we are translating it into data. And therefore, we create definitions to represent it. And those definitions might appear entirely arbitrary. And so a good question to ask is the data or definition appropriate to its cultural and normative environment? And some of these definitions might have ethical implications, as of course the case I presented does. The cultural and ethics are not immutable, and therefore we need to approach data collection with care. Now, just to use the stick on myself, a few years ago, I helped a group of clinical statisticians carry out a differential geographic analysis of survival rates for certain highly specialized elective surgical procedures. And we looked at how mortality for this type of operations changed across the country. Now, this is one example. It produced a map. Now, at the basic level, this map is telling us a simple story. People die after this surgery to a different extent in different parts of the country. But if you start digging deeper, you might notice a few areas that need probing. For example, why are the regions defined the way they are? How did people die after the surgery? Was their death related directly to the operation? How long after the operation did death occur? and how many operations are run in each of these areas. Now, we did address some of these questions in the paper, but you can see that answering them requires discussing definitions and in-depth conversations that is hard to capture on a single map. And in order to take action with data, there is a need to understand also the process of data collection. So for what purpose that data collection was established, keep an eye open to wrong assumption. It's very, very easy to make wrong assumptions. Take the issue of, we've seen this in the UK, where to attribute the record of a COVID infection. I find the problem here when the figures of students who had been tested positive were incorrectly attributed to their parents' address rather than to the location of their home of residence. This is because the data collection asks for a home address rather than asking for the current or ordinary location of address. And this little error resulted in inflating infection rates in the borough of Richmond, which is a relatively wealthy suburb of London with probably a large population that sends its children to study outside. Fixing this problem requires an understanding of the context in which data collection and reporting happens. And to communicate data effectively, analysts should always work together with, let's say, situational experts. The pandemic also put data journalists' choices of data representation under the spotlight. I'd like to mention here John Byrne-Murdoch, who's a journalist at the Financial Times, a widely followed authority on the journalistic use of data. He spent a lot of time on video and social media to engage with the public in order to explain the newspaper's choices, to defend them, sometimes actually change the way the Financial Times represented data as a result of those conversations. I mean, this is very positive, I think, in terms of building trust, and some of these discussions probably are now familiar. Should we use absolute counts of cases of figures per capita, adjusted for population size? Should we use a linear or logarithmic scale? Is a rolling average a better indicator of trends as opposed to a spline? I think John did great work in this, trying to explain that sometimes at different stages of the pandemic, different choices in data visualization were necessary in order to convey the real message, for example, around the seriousness of the infection. Now, data collection can be controversial, can be political. We all appreciate the need for accurate data reporting about the pandemic because data enables us to monitor the spread, to take action to mitigate the risk and the impact of the virus. Now, despite the main issues we discussed, without data, we wouldn't be able to do anything about the pandemic. We would be in the same situation as our ancestors dealing with the plague. Now, data collection can be relatively uncontentious in the context of a global pandemic. And I have to say, in the UK, there are regulations that allow us to start tracking data if there is a public health reason to do so. But it's not without problems if we see data collection more generally. Now, quickly setting up data collection, once again, for tracking and tracing patients in the context of an emergency, probably enjoys some degree of support. I mean, I would say good support, at least in this country. But two things happen. So the first one is that emergency situations aren't the black swan events that we sometimes make them out to be, and therefore we should be ready and prepared to collect the data. And the other is that in reality, in a very fast-paced situation like an emergency, there might be little time to set up new data processes. And therefore, many decisions related to data collection must be taken, so to say, at peacetime, when most people don't see the immediate benefit of data collection, or actually might be actively opposed to it. Interesting example here, a few years ago, the then Health and Social Care Information Center announced a data collection program called Care.data. The idea behind this program was brilliant, getting family doctors to automatically extract data about all their patients, transfer this data into a central facility in order to power medical research. Now, two acts of parliament provided legal backing to this program, and it was also set up to allow patients to opt out of it. So it looked like everything had been set up properly. Now, the program, however, turned out to be controversial, and it was so controversial that it was shut down just 3 years after it had been started. So what happened? Well, the program has somehow mishandled a key question, the question of trust. Sure, information leaflets have been distributed, but there was increasing objection. Like patient rights organization objected that there hadn't been, let's say, simply enough effort to reach patients and raise their awareness. Doctors started to complain that they didn't know the process to let patients opt out. On the other hand, privacy activists raised the alarm that the program wasn't clear about data sharing to third parties. Media stories started to emerge on the potential for misuse by insurance companies. Now, all this together escalated very quickly, and the program was ultimately abandoned. And if you think about it, Care.Data was the kind of program that could be helpful to prevent, monitor, understand, and take action in whatever future health crisis. But we cannot do that without really addressing the issue of trust and proper engagement to communicate the benefits. And the public needs to travel that journey into data along with public authorities and the media. There is a lot that could be said about the issue of engagement and trust, and we don't have time to do that. But I just wanted to touch upon the issue as it is and will be increasingly important in the next few years. Let me just say that the concept of ethics and trust are now increasingly present in policy making. The UK government, for example, has set up a few years ago a Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation with the mandate to research and adopt a more solid ethical approach across government for the use of data. Now, my probably favorite topic here, we've seen data-driven metrics in the political discourse being used, abused, manipulated to argue for policies and to monitor the delivery of government services. This final chapter is about data graduating and becoming a first-class citizen and the policy objective in its own right. So what is open data? There are many competing definitions of open data. So let me just mention you one. According to the Open Knowledge Foundation, open data is data that can be freely used, reused, and redistributed by anyone, subject only at most to the requirement to attribute and share alike. In general, this definition is interpreted as to guarantee that a dataset must be in a format that can be automatically processed by a computer rather than, let's say, an image. There should not be any limitation imposed on the use of data, although in practice this is interpreted in many different ways. And openness refers to the fact that data should be interoperable. A technical word that means that it should be usable on different computer platforms or linkable to other datasets. Now, how do we go from something this technical into something that has to do with public communications? And we must thank a natural disaster. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina killed almost 2,000 people and caused $125 billion of damage, particularly in Louisiana. The government struggled to react, and as a response to this lack of intervention, isolated citizens started organizing to help their neighbors. And to better direct the help, they started to put together data sets of population statistics and other information useful to, let's say, reach the victims. And they did that by copying the information off government websites. Now, governments ultimately love this idea. It makes a good story, so data can help people, can even save lives, and government can become really popular if they enable all of this by making data available. Now, how strongly data entered the zeitgeist is highlighted by the so-called armchair auditor statement by David Cameron, who was then the leader of the opposition. At the time, there was an expense scandal at the House of Commons, and the government was considering the release of the MP's expenses claims. Cameron linked these two events and said, just imagine the effect that an army of armchair auditors is going to have on those expense claims. So this was the idea that ordinary people would take the data made available by the government or those expense claims, analyze it, hold the powerful to account, and make public authorities more efficient. And governments around the world created public data portals based on this premise. The word of consultancy jumped into it, as it often does, suggesting open data would unleash massive economic development and business opportunities. A famous McKinsey report stated in 2013, open data can help create $3 trillion a year of value in the economy. And communication about data at the time included this statement quite a lot. To the point that open data became a tool in the political arsenal. I mean, party election manifestos here in 2015 devoted pages to tell what they will achieve with open data once in power. Now, how to measure the success of open data initiative, however, was always somehow unclear. And sometimes it turned into competition about how many data sets could be released rather than any measure of how useful they were. Famous statement here by the UK Environment Secretary set a target in 2015 of having at least 8,000 data sets released in 1 year. And the department scrambled to meet this target to the point that there were accusations of, so to say, salami slicing data sets, so splitting data sets in multiple chunks just to increase the count. So years after Katrina, what have been the outcomes of all this narrative arc? So to be honest, I'm yet to meet armchair auditors who really expose anything useful, although we have loads of conspiracy theories based on open data. McKinsey's assessment didn't measurably materialize. There's a lot of data on government portals, but it's often hard to find and pretty unusable. So the question is, was open data just a PR exercise? And I don't think so. I mean, I'm still a big advocate for open data. I think open data has introduced two important concepts into the public sphere. First, the awareness that data can be used in operations. And second, the fact that transparency and engagement are a positive value that all public authorities should aspire to. Here I want to introduce you to Claire Moriarty, who was the permanent secretary at the Department of the Environment at the time of their thousands of data releases. Claire was a strong supporter of open data, and she suggested that open data created something positive, almost by side effect. She said opening our data was at most half the issue. More important was the effect it had on open working among colleagues. That led to interesting discussion about how open government relates to accountability. It took us into how we can be more open as individuals, building respect and trust. Open has all sorts of dimensions, being open to challenge, open to new experiences, open to new ideas, open to difference. And this is a very important step, I think, in the relationship between public administrations and the public they serve. So I've been an advocate of open data for years. I mean, my career developed in part by trying to make open data an effective movement. And I'm still an advocate, but I'm aware that we need to be careful about overstating what data can do. And on the other hand, we have actually problems sometimes with open data. Someone called Terence Eden, who's an excellent technology advisor in the UK government, described well the dangers of careless openness. He analyzed the gas meter data set. Now, this is allegedly an innocent data set, but he found that it's very simple to discover what's, let's say, your neighbor's gas supplier. Meanwhile, the land registry has a public and open record of all residential property transactions. This means that you now know how much your neighbors paid for their property, which can give away information about their wealth. Linking up this data to other data sets, for example, an equally open register of companies may reveal more and more about individuals, even in entirely non-fully personal data sets like the one you mentioned. And there's always a risk for ID fraud. We need to be vigilant for two reasons. The first is that, of course, the privacy issue is real. I'm not denying it. The second is, however, that the privacy issue itself might be exploited for the wrong reason by those who have an interest in governments being less transparent. These are antipodean problems, but they are intrinsically related. So I hope you follow me so far. It's time for me to wrap up. I presented you with a combination of horror stories and good uses of data in the public sphere. And my major message is simple. Using data, numeric or otherwise, in public communication is difficult, full of hidden caveats, and communicating this difficulty should be our major concern, whether we are public official, journalists, or even scientists. In order to communicate data well, we need to know the data we're talking about well, and not make assumptions about it. We need to know the process that generates the data. We need to know and communicate the context in which the data was collected, the context in which it is used. We need to know enough about the problems we're trying to address with data, and we need data to be good enough to be actionable, and we need to describe what actionable means. I've spoken extensively of definitions. The definitions are probably the most important aspect of effective data communication, especially because definition of concepts tend to differ sometimes relevantly from the common sense definition that we might have in mind about that same concept. And it's also important to have in mind whether there is an authoritative source of the data, who owns the data. The fundamental lesson I've learned here in over 15 years of working in this space, and to connect to the beginning of this lecture, is that data is entirely a multidisciplinary endeavor. Communicating data surely requires the technical ability of analyzing it, the ability to tell stories with it, It's helped by the ability to capture the key lessons by visualizing it, but none of this will do in isolation. And in these days, there's more. Good data communication requires an appreciation of ethical and legal issues. Most problems I mentioned tonight are not unique to data, and data is affected by the same issues that science communication suffers from. It's generally centered around the issue of uncertainty and around the risk for scientific findings being twisted. There is also for us an extra risk in politics and policy, which is that data-driven evidence might clash with policy. In the UK, a decade ago, the government sacked its chief drug advisor, Professor David Nutt, who was the chairman of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, respected academic, for making a claim in a research paper that ecstasy was less dangerous than alcohol. This was something that was against that government's policy. The relationship between science, politics, policy, and judiciary even is troublesome. There was a debate here a few years ago around the bill called the Investigatory Powers Bill, which required internet providers to weaken encryption in ways that were mathematically impossible. The problem is that science can be interpreted politically. That data suffers from the same issue. So data stewardship, curation, leadership are the key ingredients to fight back against all of these issues. On the one hand, we need to be really careful not to fall to the curse of impartiality. Data is not impartial because there is no such thing as just using the data to explain a phenomenon. As I hope I described tonight, the use of data can always be driven by an agenda, even unconsciously. So using data in public communication requires explanations and context, which goes somehow against the fast and furious news cycle of today. On the other hand, we also need a bit of healthy skepticism about the power of data alone to explain everything. Data very often has questions to offer. It doesn't offer answers. So if we are tempted to say that the data speaks for itself, we need to stop and rethink because the data can't speak. Now, that's the end of my lecture. Let me just mention that all my slides, notes, and bibliography, and potentially a transcript, if I manage to, will be available on my website, probably by the weekend if I can find some time to upload them. And on that note, thank you very much.